Friends, chess players, welcome back. Today we're launching a brand new format. The ranking, the top tier list of chess openings. And today we'll start with those against 1e4, so I'll try to evaluate as many as possible and create the final ranking of these openings here. First of all, before we even begin, let's start with something very important, context. Let's put things into context, meaning what I'm going to say today. But is from the perspective of a basic or intermediate chess player, and therefore which opening to choose. From this point of view then, I will evaluate openings based also on their complexity, the amount of theory involved, and the player's development. Otherwise, if we were talking about openings for masters, this video wouldn't make sense. For masters, there are basically 4 fundamental openings: the French, the Italian, the King's Pawn Game, the Caro-Kann, and the Sicilian. These 4 are the strongest, the others are inferior. Obviously today we'll put all of them into context to understand at slightly lower levels what makes sense to look at and what doesn't. Let's start with some openings whose existence I wasn't even aware of, so for some of them I actually had to look them up. The first is the O'Neill Gambit, e4-b5. So this gambit consists of white taking a pawn and black managing to develop the bishop via fianchetto. And well, how else can we evaluate the O'Neill Gambit if not down here? Let's just say it's not worth sacrificing a pawn like that on move 1. Let's move on to the second one. The second is none other than the Duras Gambit, so e4 to f5. So here too, let's say white takes a pawn pretty much for free, and on top of that weakens their position quite a bit. The opponent's king, let's say it's a king's gambit, but with one less tempo and without the central pawn. In short, don't do it, don't do it. So the Duras Gambit, let's also put it here among the serious mistakes. And now let's move on to one of my best friends, namely the Caro-Kann defense. So the Caro-Kann defense, as I told you before, is one of the 4 strongest openings against 1e4. As you know on my channel, I don't recommend it often because at lower levels. What's the problem with the Caro-Kann? First, there's a lot of theory to learn. It's a very theoretical opening. Second, generally white has the opportunity to play as they wish. So white can take space, white can keep the initiative. In short, in my opinion, with the Caro-Kann defense, you give too many opportunities to your opponent to play, so at the lower intermediate level. I wouldn't recommend it because I don't see why we should give our opponent so many opportunities. So anyway, we'll keep the Caro-Kann here, we'll keep it at level 3. Because objectively, let's say it's one of the best openings. It's just that, in my opinion, at a lower level, I don't see why it should be recommended so much. And now let's move on to another variation. Another one of the fantastic ones, 4. The French defense. In my opinion, it's a very interesting variation that also leads to many interesting positions. The famous French center. One of the most fascinating variations in history, also great for studying and improving as a player. I have to say that lately I've discovered that there's a bit less theory in the French than I thought, in particular because both in the classical variation and with knight, d2 has started to gain ground after e4, with all the great French masters updating many years of old theory. And I have to say that the French thus represents a good alternative for learning a lot, because the structure is very significant. And in any case, you can have a very strong repertoire without an overly exaggerated theoretical study. So, in my opinion, we'll still put the French here. We're not putting it at the very top because, after all, we are sacrificing a bit of space. And if possible, I'd prefer not to give my opponent any space in the opening, even from the very first levels. And now let's move on to this other opening, which is quite curious and has even been played by Magnus Carlsen himself. The St. George e4-6. Just think Magnus in a serious tournament. He beat a grandmaster with e4-6, and this shows us that what top GMs play isn't always necessarily something good. Let's say the idea behind this variation is to gain space with the move b5. And then let's say to reposition this bishop on b7 without losing the pawn. Obviously it's a move that doesn't control the center, a move that is also somewhat slow. However, usually you can still manage to return to the typical structures of the modern defense, because in any case, black will eventually continue with g6, bishop to g7, and in the end a 6b5. It's a setup that is used from time to time, so obviously it's not a particularly recommended opening, but let's say it's not terrible either, like the O'Neill or the Duras Gambit, so we'll rank it a bit higher. And finally, we arrive at this one. I'm putting it here for you. and then I'll comment on it. Rightly so, guys, it's a bit of patriotism. This Italian flag at the top, the Italian game. In general, what does King's game mean? Because Italian game can mean everything and nothing. It just means playing a4 and e5 here. The Italian game, of course, is this position here where white plays with knight to c3. However, obviously here white, let's say, has the option to play the Spanish, can play it. Of course, the Scotch at the beginning, or could have played the Vienna game. Okay, in this context, when I say Italian game, I mean playing this. A main e4, e5 repertoire, so that to knight f3 we respond with knight f6. Then if we decide to play the Italian with bishop to c5, or if we decide to play the two knights with knight to f6. In short, I include them all. They all work well, so I put the king's pawn game in first place because, in my opinion, it's the opening that every beginner should know. That's because we start to get familiar with the concept of space, with the concept of initiative, and of course it's also one of the strongest openings, even according to modern computers. So, in my view, from every perspective, it deserves to be in first place. Obviously, there's a lot of theory to study, no doubt about it, but it's the kind of opening that helps us improve as players by understanding certain dynamics of these structures, so I can't help but put it in first place. And after that we have the Borg defense e4 to g5, with the idea basically of doing something similar to what we were doing with the St. George your turn. Here there's also the line where you sacrifice the pawn basically. This too is a kind of grob as a counter move. So since the grob is the worst opening that according to the computer can be played with white, we play it with black to have better success. Jokes aside, obviously, we simply can't help but put it down here. Attention everyone, pay close attention, look what's coming, look what's coming right now. Here comes the legendary Stafford Gambit. Yes, the incredible Stafford Gambit is finally here. Plastered all over every international and Italian chess clickbait channel as a weapon, guys. This gambit, 1, is wrong if played correctly. 2, doesn't help you improve at chess because you're just playing tricks. 3, in any case, it doesn't represent a universal repertoire. This is because, let's say, here white is not at all forced to capture on e5. They can easily go back into the 4 knights game, so they're not even obliged to take the pawn. So you can't even build a complete repertoire with the Stafford. So I'm sorry, but we're only putting the Stafford here because the others are really, really bad. But okay, don't play the Stafford, you won't improve with the Stafford. And here I start to see some colors, some familiar colors, namely the Sicilian defense. The Sicilian defense, I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to surprise you, I'll place it and then I'll comment on it. I'm going to surprise you because I'm putting the Sicilian defense here. And you might say to me, but how can you put the Sicilian, your favorite opening, next to the Caro-Can? How could you do such a thing? Obviously, everything always needs to be put into context, guys. Why? Why does it need to be put into context? Because for a beginner, for an intermediate player, the Sicilian has a lot of practical problems. First of all, an unimaginable amount of theory, so already is not really suitable. Then what we need to understand is that the idea of the Sicilian, let's say for example the Sicilian with d6. No. The idea behind the Sicilian is that black is exchanging a side pawn for a central one, and this will give him an advantage because he will have more pawns in the center. But this advantage is one that he will be able to use in the long term. In the early stages of the game, in the opening and middle game, look at white. White has all the files nicely open and in short can develop his pieces as he sees fit. The Sicilian opening, the Sicilian defense. It's an opening that requires a very high level of understanding to play. It's not an opening for a beginner or even an intermediate player, which is exactly why I've only included it here. And let's move on. Here we come to the defense. Oh, and this sort of modern defense, but on the other side. So, let's say the Owen defense is a playable opening, but not particularly good. This is because white comfortably takes the center and can defend it in several ways. He can defend it with the bishop, or he can defend it with the knight. Yes, black has some ideas for play, but it's a worse version of the modern defense, so the Owen defense anyway. We have to put it down here. And now we come to an opening that I really like for beginners, which is the Philidor. In particular, I will review the Philidor Han-Ham for you, which is the one that starts like this, with e5 here, so it allows the exchange of queens, or after knight nf3 is played like this, with knight bd7, and then you continue with c6, queen c7. This is the structure. This structure meets many good requirements. First, it's easy to play, there's very little theory. Second, it's also very effective from the perspective of modern theory. So this opening is also played by masters, so I definitely recommend it for beginners, more from a strategic point of view, okay? It's a defensive position, not an attacking one. But I recommend it to beginners because it's easy, and in any case it's quite good, so we're going to put it up here. After that, what the hell? Speaking of the position, we're at the perk. Here we are. This is the review of the perk. Now, the perk is actually one of those openings that I don't recommend, because here white is left with, let's say, a lot of opportunities. White can play in several ways, can go for the variation with long castling or the one with short castling. And in all cases, white will be in a very good position. So I don't really like it as an idea, so we'll put it down low. But since all things considered, it doesn't have that much theory, so we'll put it here because, okay, it's obviously not as good as the Caro-Kann or the Sicilian, but it has much less theory. So in the end, for beginners, it can be a usable weapon to, to be able to, play. And at this point, let's move on to another defense, which is the Russian defense. So the Russian defense, but played the correct way, so without the Stafford Gambit, just to be clear. In my opinion, the Russian defense isn't bad, and I would place it here. And the same concept I mentioned for the Caro-Kann applies. The Russian defense, let's say, gives the opponent the opportunity to have many ideas, many variations, but in some way, in the end, compared to the Caro-Kann, it's easy to play and there's little theory. So it has some of the negative aspects of the Caro-Kann, but it also has positive sides, and objectively it's good. So we'll put it here. And now let's move on to one of my favorites for beginners, which is the Scandinavian defense. I've told you this several times. The Scandinavian defense is not the most correct opening in the world. But for a beginner, it allows us to build a repertoire that's actually quite aggressive with really, really little theory to learn. So for me, the Scandinavian goes here, I'll put it here, and let's move on to another opening. A bit of a strange one, which is the Lycan. Actually, it's also perfectly playable. The problem is that, in my opinion, for a beginner, throwing yourself into these positions where we haven't developed a single piece yet, and white has taken too much space in the center, it's not something I can recommend to beginners. The opening is playable, it's not bad, but for some reason, I really feel like I absolutely have to find a way to put this thing right here. Then let's go to the opposite, that is the Nimzowitsch. And here too, let's say, there are many interesting variations where black immediately strikes in the center with d5. There are good prospects, but again, for a beginner, I don't particularly recommend it because these are all positions a bit strange, a bit tricky to understand certain things. So honestly, yes, I would keep it here. Let's tidy things up a bit here. The graphics, I would keep it here. And the last one is the defense, the modern defense. So e4 and 4, g6, let's say. I'm a big fan of the modern. I've played it for a long time, but in some ways what we said about the perk also applies here. So honestly, I'd be tempted to place it here together with the perk. But come on, out of personal preference, it can't be on the same level as the perk. Let's put it there, but okay, generally we should place it somewhere in the middle. Well, I hope you enjoyed this new format, so let me know in the comments what you think about it. Of course, I'll do this with other openings as well. The next episode will be about d4, and I repeat, folks, naturally, these ideas should be considered from the perspective of beginners and intermediate players. Otherwise, it's clear that we'd have to rank things like this, right? With the 4 strongest openings up here and everything else below, right? So I tried to put it in the context of a club player who has to choose an opening. As always, if you want to support the channel, I invite you to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next videos.